Zain, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on. Zain, for those listening in and perhaps watching, you've certainly got quite a fair bit of experience in data strategy, analytics, and artificial intelligence. In fact, over 18 years of experience in that space. Just to give people a bit of an idea, you've helped to modernize data analytics and AI platforms for a $5 billion global consumer company and delivered 2 million in annual savings. At First Republic Bank, you led strategy, sales, and operations for a $2.7 billion book of business, driving a 42% year-over-year sales increase. And perhaps another example has been growing a 2 million revenue auto startup into a 17 million business with a 143 compound annual growth rate by leveraging data to uncover growth potential, despite having no prior industry experience. So I'm curious, why leave the corporate space behind and strike out on your own to create Zeed as it is today?
Yeah, great question, Vinay. Most of my career has been spent in data analytics and strategy, and primarily for large corporate firms. I think it just reached a point where I realized that I can have more impact by going from working with a multitude of companies simultaneously rather than helping one company and deepening the relationship there. And then on a personal level, I think I have run my own P&Ls within corporate entities before. And I thought I might like to do that without kind of the safety net of the corporate structure and just push myself to see
Okay,
if
so
we
a
can
bit of a
manage it.
personal challenge or a desire to scratch a personal itch. Will that be correct?
Yeah, scratch an itch, right? If I go all the way back to when I was in business school, we had this discussion, I remember one day, about what's the purpose of getting an MBA? Is it to go work for someone else or is it to go into business for yourself? And at the time, I actually had my own business. I had an import export business. And then soon thereafter, my wife and I had our first child. And then I thought it would be amazing to have health insurance. And so I pivoted into the
Yeah.
corporate world, right? Subsidized, employer subsidized health insurance. But ultimately, I think the purpose of that sort of education is to teach yourself the
Yeah.
basic skills of how to run a business holistically, right? Get a comprehensive view of marketing, management, accounting, finance, etc. And so now
Yeah.
I just felt like a really
Right.
good time for me.
And given your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
I would say there are two competing. One
Yeah.
is relationship development and building relationships with people. The way I grew up and the time and place I grew up, there weren't very many people like me in my environment. And so, in order to survive and live a satisfactory childhood, I had to be good at finding ways to build relationships with people. And that gives me a lot of energy, actually, is being able to relate with people in general. And then the other one, the more innate skill, is being able to understand numbers and data and analytics. And I've always had this ability to tell a story with numbers. I didn't realize when I
Mhm.
was a kid that this would be a marketable skill by the time I was an adult. But I think that's why I'm so happy and satisfied with my professional journey now is I found that kind of intersection of building relationships with people, building relationships with numbers, bringing those two things together in order to create value for
Very
organizations.
interesting. I'm curious, given those two areas of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like this comes up a lot. Often, what I have seen in businesses is people lean on their own strengths. And often,
Yeah.
especially as you move up an organization into the people with the fanciest titles and lack of humility. And what I mean by that is understanding
Mhm.
that no one knows everything. And so, in order to actually continue to grow and develop, even if you have a C-level title and a big corner office, is acknowledging that there may be other people or other teams in your organization which can actually help you continue to grow and develop. And where I've seen that the most play out repeatedly is senior stakeholders have ideas for how to drive their business, and they're good ideas. They're rooted in their own experience, their own knowledge, their own understanding of how they were successful over the track of their career. But now data is a foreign entity to them, or maybe understanding data to its fullest extent. And then on the other hand, you have a team of more technical people who understand data and understand analytics and understand what the numbers are telling them. but they may not necessarily understand the business intuitively. So being able to find that common ground of humility to help each other see
Hmm.
that.
With this idea of bringing data-driven strategies into companies, especially in light of a desire for revenue growth, I would think that perhaps a good step would be to assess how ready they are. And how would you recommend that companies do that? Because I think most companies, whether they be service-based or tech-based, produce a wealth of data. But how would they assess their readiness beyond just acknowledging that they do have tons of data
Yeah.
to use?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. Our approach typically and what we recommend to organizations and to leaders is
Mhm.
understand whether their business strategy is aligned with their data strategy or AI strategy, right? As the case is these days where
Mhm.
everyone's hot for AI, everyone has AI fever. But is the data strategy actually driving the AI strategy? Or the data work, the analytics work, the AI work, is that compartmentalized and just like shiny new toys that your organizations are trying to develop without actually understanding whether or not they're rooted in organizational value creation? So we try to take data strategy as the foundational piece to understand what pieces are available internally in terms of what data. You may want to come up with something really imaginative to grow top line revenue. But if it's not aligned with the strategic priorities of the company and the internal resources,
Mhm.
that may not be the best tack to take. Right. So we're very process oriented. Data strategy fuels the business strategy. Business strategy fuels the data strategy. The data strategy then in turn helps prioritize use cases based on what
Mhm.
the strategic priorities of the organization are, right? And from there, we'll come up with modular pieces of work around data analytics and then AI readiness to ensure that there's a scalable platform that we're building rather than building like
Mhm.
one-off shiny new toys, right? Because that's the space we try not to avoid, or we try to avoid is we try not to get into the space where people are building something amazing in short term that won't
Mhm.
create scalable long-term
Um,
value.
so having the business strategy really laid out and crystal clear is key. In terms of being able to identify what types of data would be required, is that a bit of a conversation piece that you sometimes need to have, or is that almost like a no-brainer, given that once the metric is identified, the data source is also identified?
I know it is very
Right.
much a conversation piece each and every time, right? Each and every time. That to me, Vinay, that's the key to the whole thing is bringing the people into the conversation rather than just assuming that a question you're getting or a directive you're getting from a customer,
Yeah.
they know unequivocally what they're asking for. Often they don't. Back to my earlier point, often they're asking the right question, but they don't understand the pool of resources available to help answer that question in a more
Mhm.
methodical, holistic way. And so engaging in conversation to ask those questions to flesh out exactly what it is people are seeking. That's how we then identify the elements of data, the sources of data. There may be data elements which are available, but you had never thought would create value because you hadn't
Mhm.
thought to ask the right questions before, because we're often constrained by our own
Mm.
experience, right? That,
If I understand this correctly, you're coming in essentially looking at what they want to achieve and almost suggesting a little bit of a pilot, if I could put it that way, in order to test out a hypothesis and see if it brings a value. Would that be correct?
and that would be fair, right? That would be a very astute observation. And again, it's rooted in value creation. Like that, I can't overstate that enough because we need these pilots. Like we don't back up. I'm an agile practitioner. And so I believe in iterative value creation. And we want to make sure that whatever we're building can stand alone, but also can be foundational. Like you can
Mm.
build on it modularly going forward. And often what we encounter, especially in the sort of organizations we work with, which are more traditional in their thinking, and they maybe haven't embraced data as a value
Mhm.
in terms of the asset value, is being able to deliver something incremental that demonstrates the value of data and starting to shift their culture into becoming a more data informed culture in terms of decision making. That usually will
Mhm.
get the wheels and the
To
momentum
help us
spinning.
wrap our minds around this, is there perhaps an example that of a company that you worked with where the data analytics and the working with data certainly led to an increase in revenue. And what were the kind of the key factors involved in that increase?
Yeah, sure. From an analytics perspective, I'll give you two quick examples. From an analytics perspective, a sales organization we were working with, about $4 billion in gross sales. They opened a call center, right? They had traditionally been like a retail storefront, and they opened a call center. And part and parcel of that was rolling out a uniform telephony platform across both channels. So the idea being you call Vinay and you call your nearest location and no one can answer there. So the call center is going to pick that up, and it's the calls going out in concentric circles. And this all happens within seconds, right? You don't notice it's happening. And so when the platform was rolled out, we had all this data about the retail store phone calls and the percentage of calls they were answering. And it was unusually low, much lower than everybody expected. Deep diving into the analytics, we realized that the people in those locations had not been adequately trained on how to answer the phone based on system optimization, if you like. And so when we first showed these reports to the regional vice presidents, they were like, no, these numbers can't be right. They're too low. Our people are answering the phones. Like, we're just telling you what the data is showing us, right? The data is just a scoreboard. And when we dove into it, that's when we uncovered that people weren't interacting with the system in the way that they were trained to do. So instead of I'm going to go get a coffee and I push a certain button on my phone, I just get up and go get a coffee because that's what I've been doing for 25 years. Now, when the phone rings and no one's there to answer it, we see that in the data that the call went unanswered. So being able to demonstrate that we actually had data which highlighted what the operational behavior was, generated the impetus to actually change the operational behavior. We found one champion in terms of one of the regional vice presidents. He was all in on the data. He turned his region around first, then was able to hold up his trophy to his colleagues and say, look, the data took us down the path. We had to change our behavior at our stores. We did. Now we're seeing not only an increase in answered call percentage, but our sales are also going up because the money we're spending on marketing to generate those phone calls, we're answering them, translating into sales. The other one would be from an operational point of view, taking a $2 million revenue business that was unprofitable and leveraging data to better understand who the target segments were that we should be focusing on, and taking the data, understand where the key markets were that we could grow. And so 3.5 years of integrating data along with experiential decision-making, we grew a $2 million unprofitable revenue line into a $70 million profitable revenue line. And the thing that really differentiated us in the industry was our use of data, because again, it was very traditional industry, right? Auto repair, very traditional thinking, not really on the cutting edge of data. So now you're interjecting data into the decision-making process. Not that you should simply do whatever the data tells you, but it's a tool, right? It helps inform decision-making. So yeah, it's definitely, I'm a huge advocate, obviously, for leveraging data to help make better decisions, to especially
in the first example, you talked about finding a champion within the organization. I'm assuming that you'd be looking for someone who certainly shows an interest in the data and what is possible to identify your champion. First off, is there more to that process of finding a champion? And second, given your relationship building tendencies, what would you do in order to assist the champion be your spokesperson within the organization?
Yeah, I think both of those questions they have the same answer. And it's really a lot of it is around enablement. So how do you create the advocacy in the first place to have a champion support you? It's being able to demonstrate that we understand the business and we're not just spitting out reports for the sake of spitting out reports, but we actually understand the analytics and the insights to drive the business and move the needle going forward. And so we have a nuanced understanding of the business too, just from a different lens, right? Instead of being boots on the ground and interacting with customers every day, we're looking at the data, but we're coming back with the same conclusions. And then the second part of it, really, that then drives the enablement piece, because we don't want to use data analytics or AI as tools that we just throw over the fence and expect people to run with. We actually want to make sure that people are empowered to use those tools in an intelligent way to demonstrate the value of it, because that's how our value is actually created, right? Being able to make the most sophisticated machine and you hand it off to someone and they don't know how to drive it or operate it, that's useless. That creates value for no one, right? But the enablement piece is key. Being able to hold someone's hand and get them to understand what's been built, why it's the relevant thing for them, how it can help their business and their team, and then allow them to practice, right, operating themselves before they feel a level of comfort, and you let go of their hand and you watch them run,
I
which is
would
also a very
imagine. So,
satisfying feeling.
what would you say from your experience and observation are some of the issues that companies tend to run into as they scale their data strategy in light of revenue growth?
Yeah. So the first one is, I
Mhm.
think often it's lack of a strategy, which is surprisingly common, where companies, maybe they've grown organically over a period of 30, 40, 50 years, and it's not necessarily rooted in any kind of plan. And so there's this assumption that it's going to last forever, right? So obviously that's the first thing. The next thing I would say is, like I said, that linkage
Mhm.
between data strategy and business strategy, making sure that the data strategy actually enables growth in the business. The third thing I would say is being able to understand that we're living in a dynamic world. And so just because we have a plan today doesn't mean that plan is
Mhm.
indefinitely going to last into perpetuity, right? There may be things that are happening at a macro level or an internal level, which will require you to pivot. So, like, I believe a
Mhm.
good strategy is flexible. Any good plan is flexible. I've seen that, however, become an impediment for some organizations where they're so married to their strategy because they've invested so much from a resource perspective, technical resources, human resources, that they simply have to
Mhm.
execute the plan as it's been constructed without understanding that the world is a dynamic place and things change. You have to be able to pivot and respond based on the world we live
Great points there. When we look at AI coming into play as it is today and evolving the way it is, a lot of businesses that have agreed that using AI is a given. But given the concerns around security, data privacy, and this idea of using AI without bias, what would be your recommendations, especially in light of ensuring that it enhances a data strategy?
Yeah. On the bias piece first, so I just wrote an article about this day before yesterday. I would say the recommendation is about building as a diverse team as possible to help understand the scope of the work
Mhm.
that's being done. We're humans, we all inherently have our own bias. But if everyone on the
Mhm.
team thinks like me, that's going to skew the bias in the data and then subsequently the AI applications even further. So how do you, starting at the human level, how do you build a diverse team with diverse perspectives to make sure that you've got a broad sample of representation going into your data interpretation and the modeling and into the AI application? That would be the first thing. As far as data privacy goes, what I personally think we're going to see more of as there's a proliferation of AI applications, although I haven't heard much about it, I feel like as we started 2025, everybody was hot. The AI fever was pivoting away from
Mhm.
Gen AI into agentic AI. I actually think what we're going to start seeing is federated AI. And so that is to say, rather than bringing all
Mhm.
of the data into one environment, because even if you're anonymizing data, Vinay, if you have enough data points
Mhm.
about someone, you can tell who they are. You can figure it out. So federated AI means you do the modeling in its own kind of unique platform, and then you bring the statistics from that model, and that's where the data integration happens, right? That maintains a higher degree of privacy and security. And I think it's a matter of time before that's the way that most organizations start to pivot. Maybe this is wishful thinking, but I would like to think that we've learned our lessons from social media in terms of
Mhm.
data exposure and privacy, and that as we go full steam ahead into the AI generation, we're more thoughtful and mindful about how we maintain that privacy before we
Hmm.
actually build
So, if I
applications.
understand this idea of federated AI, you essentially have subsets, if I could use that word, of AI performing technical roles, which then sends their findings to another AI piece that compiles the data to offer up suggestions and make decisions. Okay.
Yeah, let's say if you and I are working together, instead of bringing all of our data into one environment in an integrated way, which is very traditional, right? In order to maintain that privacy, you might build your model separately from mine, right? Different environment, different tools, different platform. The statistics yielded from your model and the statistics yielded from my model That's the
Yeah,
integration that gets fed into
certainly.
the AI platform.
That would be an interesting trend to watch and see how it plays out. When it comes to using AI, given that thinking around the federated AI piece, would you also suggest that companies would increasingly incorporate AI to act as data scientists or business analysts on an ongoing basis to not just ensure businesses are on track with their overall business objectives, but in bringing up to the surface potential data points that could be acted on in order to make use of opportunities that would allow for greater revenue growth?
Yeah, so that's a great question. How I would respond to that is this idea of finding statistical outliers and having mechanisms in place to create alerts whenever something is irregular.
Mhm.
That's not a new idea. I think what's changing and evolving with technology is this level of sophistication. So now it's not just an alert because something is a statistical outlier, but being able to
Mhm.
uncover the underlying reason for that, right? Through analysis. What I think the role of the person will still be indefinitely is interpreting that information to make it
Mhm.
usable and actionable. I have friends who are even more technology savvy than me, where they think that's on the precipice of the machine actually making the
Mhm.
decision for you. You basically write the script and the machines are doing all the work. I personally think there'll always be a space to keep a human in the loop and have that interpretation
Mhm.
layer be at the human
Certainly.
level.
Trust, building trust, especially with potential clients, is key from what I'm hearing. How do you go about doing that, especially with those who, especially with organizations where you might find a certain section that are quite hesitant to adopt data-driven strategies?
Yeah, that is a phenomenal
Mhm.
question. I run into that daily, right? I am a very, maybe too honest, but a very honest person. And I'm very upfront with people, especially when I'm beginning an engagement, to let them know I'm here to help their organization, here to help the leadership who's brought me in. But if I'm not the best person to help them, or if I think someone else can help them more effectively, I'm happy to let them know that. I have been on the client side of too many engagements throughout my career to see a company come in and basically
Mhm.
they provide a templated solution to my organization that they had installed in a different organization. But it's a different company. You've got a different org structure. You've got different people, different resources. You can't just simply drop that in and expect us to implement it with the same level of efficacy. And so I try to take a very upfront approach to explain that I'm here for the relationship for the long term. If I can help you today, fantastic. As a business
Mhm.
owner, I need client engagement. If I can't, that's okay. Maybe our paths will cross later. And perhaps I
Mhm.
can refer you to someone who can help you today. The skill set that we have is useful and valuable, but it's not I'm not willing to sacrifice personal relationships simply to illustrate the value of my
Okay, certainly.
skills, if that makes
So, is there an element of certainly talking about past instances where you've been able to help companies in order to bring people who are perhaps a little resistant to data-driven strategies on side, or is there something entirely different that you would do with them?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Again, just being very candid. I had an experience earlier in my career where I was repeatedly
Hmm.
told that my ideas were dumb and stupid, and I didn't understand the business I was supporting, and I would never get any of the ideas that I had implemented in a practical way because I hadn't been doing it for 30 years in that industry specifically. And the way I've been able to overcome that is back to what we
Hmm.
talked about earlier, is getting
Okay.
quick wins, right? Establishing
Hmm.
small wins, building credibility. And then in that particular instance, over the course of 18 months, my harshest critic was then asking for how come he hadn't been getting more of my support earlier. You didn't want my support, right? You didn't think I was capable and up to helping you.
Hmm.
But yeah, that was a level of validation, obviously, because he saw the success we were having and how we were able to leverage data to drive the organization and drive top line growth. Take
You
time.
talked about your knack for being able to not just understand data, but transform it into stories that could be understood by others. What would be your recommendation for communicating complex data insights, especially to those who are non technical stakeholders?
Yeah, I think the key is, so I'll go back to, is the story you're telling rooted in
Mhm.
something valuable to the stakeholder with whom you're making the recommendation? That's the key to the whole thing, right? And then I think how you really win people over is ultimately it's sales, right? And the best sales organizations I've been a part of, or the most successful sales I've made,
Mhm.
it's not me selling something, it's me identifying a need and then being able to fill that need for my client or for my stakeholder, right? So how I frame that for people often is tell people what they want to hear,
Mhm.
then tell them what they need to hear. Because sometimes the thing they need to
Mhm.
hear is not necessarily what they believe. And what we want and what we need are not always mutually exclusive. So being able to simplify your story to align with what's valuable for the stakeholder and align it with what's important to them, right? I think that's how you get wins. I've had so many interactions with people try to explain to me, that's what the data says. I understand that. Not everyone understands what the data says. So how do you translate that into something that's going to be useful for the stakeholder? I think it's that, right? Being able to take the side of the stakeholder, the decision maker, understand what's valuable to him or her, understand how to relate what you're sharing in their own terms to make them want to
Mm.
embrace it because it's a need for
Would I
them.
be right in saying that education is a key part of even helping clients understand the need to re-examine or hone in on data-driven strategies?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like that's what we're spending most of our time on these days, especially as it relates to AI, because everyone back to the AI fever. And it's okay. I want to harness that passion and enthusiasm because that's amazing. But let's talk about the process required to build that out, right? Back to what we talked about before. It's strategy driving a solid foundation that's scalable, and then that
Mhm.
can build you the shiny.
With this education piece, is it formalized in any way, or is it pretty much in-person type? Does it take on a in-person type of nature depending upon who the client is? Okay.
Yeah, it's more of the latter, right? The process is the same, but the
Mhm.
nuance of every organization being what it is. Every organization has their own strengths and weaknesses, their own assets and their own liabilities. So we try to build, that's the benefit of being a boutique firm, right? Is we try to build our solutions around the
Mhm.
existing resources of the organization. Again, having been on the client side for so long, I don't want to take this approach of,
Mhm.
oh, you've got it all wrong. We have all the best recommendations for all the best tech. And if you just replatform everything, you're going to have an amazing solution. That often requires extra work that
Mhm.
isn't valuable, right? And if I have my data and it's not usable and it's in a primitive environment, just because I upgrade the technical environment, that doesn't make the data more usable, right? And plus, now I'm incurring a time cost and a financial cost for my client, which I don't think creates value for them. So, with education, we try to customize it
Uh,
based on the needs of the organization.
as you're speaking, the thought came to mind about transparency and empowering the entire organization to be able to make use of data and act on the insights. Is that an ongoing challenge in most organizations from your experience? And if so, how do you find the best organizations deal with
Yeah, self service is the dream, right? That's the dream in our space. So, I will say two words to you, Vinay, that are the least sexy words in our space, but maybe the most critically important, and that is data governance, right? In my experience, what data governance enables is ownership of data. And once stakeholders feel that they actually own the data, right? The technical data teams, they're moving the data around, right? But they don't actually own it. They don't own the business definitions, the logic behind the data. Once stakeholders feel that ownership through a data governance process, that then creates a cultural change where they start pushing down use of data down through the organizations. That then enables self-service along with the enablement piece, right? To make sure that people actually know how to use the tools and they understand what they're consuming. But yeah, in my experience, data governance is the key. And often it gets overlooked because it's not necessarily fun, but it is
So,
critical and
what would you say
foundational.
would be key elements of a good data governance policy?
Yeah, I would say that it starts really at the top of the organization and
Mhm.
stakeholder buy-in. right? Making sure, like anything else, if you want to affect cultural change in an organization, it has to start at the top if you want it to be effective and long lasting. And making sure that the stakeholder buy-in and the leaderships across the organization all understand their component and of data ownership and why it's so critical. Then I think it's regular engagement, right? You can't just, you can, I suppose it won't be effective. You can't just schedule a regular weekly meeting and you and I and our colleagues show up around the table for 1 hour every week and talk about whatever the work is prioritized for this week. You need engaged stakeholders, right? People have to want to see the value of that work in order to make it truly effective, right? And then to the transparency, I think it's being able to create an environment of psychological safety where I know that my work is important to me, but now in the framework of 8 of us sitting around the table in a cross-departmental meeting, I understand that prioritization of my work may not be what I think it is relative to your work, right? Because your work is absolutely mission critical to the organization. So being able to engage in that discussion, and then more importantly, having the courage to go back to my own leadership team if I'm in a corporate world, right? Or as a consultant, going back to the client and saying, this is important, but maybe it's like priority 2 or priority 3. We need to focus on priority 1 in terms of creating organizational value and doing what's part of the organization now. That can sometimes be easier said than done because every organization has its own political nuance as well, right? And back to the people part, being sensitive to that. That's why I say psychological safety is so key, because in the best organizations I've seen where this is executed the best, people actually understand that when there's this push and pull happening across the organization, it's with the organization's well-being in mind.
This idea of data strategy, we talked about federated AI as a potential outcome in the short term, but over the next, say, 5 years, how do you see the role of data strategy evolving? And in turn, what would you be recommending companies prepare for?
Yeah, I think data strategy will evolve into being part of any organization's corporate strategy. Typically, businesses are thinking like an operational financial level, right? I think data will be part and parcel of that as more traditional organizations begin to understand the value of data as an asset. How to prepare for that is understanding your data today because it may not be telling you what you think it is. And sometimes the data, like the example I gave you earlier with the call center, right? Sometimes the data reveals a truth you may not be prepared to understand. And the longer you wait to accept that, the harder it will be to actually ingest the data in a useful, actionable way, because that creates more resistance and friction, right? So being able to incorporate data into decision making at a strategic level, right? So most companies, if they have a strategy, they're looking 5 years out. What data are you leveraging today to anticipate the growth of your business over the next 5 years? Making sure that you have a deep enough understanding at the strategic level of your data that you can make those decisions. And of course, like I said, we live in a dynamic world. So no decision you're going to make today is going to hold true for the next 5 years. But that's what I think will be the biggest change is leveraging data and valuing data in the same way that companies view labor or operational components like materials or machinery, right? Leveraging and valuing data at the same level of importance in terms of developing their
Okay.
overall corporate strategy.
So, from what I'm hearing, communication is a key piece in being able to communicate across the organization as to how not just advocating for data-driven strategies, but also how come out to play as certain decisions are rolled out. What do you find to be particularly effective amongst some leaders that are able to create this change within the organization just more effectively as compared to others from a communication point of view?
So that is a great question. I think it often comes down to what incentives do leaders have to actually affect change, right? So we worked with one company where, going back up, when I was growing up in my career, I had always assumed that the people at the top of the organization were the best and brightest that the organization could offer. And as I've grown up, I've learned that's not necessarily the case. And then part and parcel of that is an executive in a particular domain may have a very limited understanding of the other domains of the organization. So I think what I've learned to put into practice is simplifying the communication to almost the least common denominator level, if that makes sense. Coming in too hot and too sophisticated is usually a recipe for disaster because now you're bifurcating your broad audience that really understands it. They might be really excited, but you need the team to be bought in conceptually across the whole team. And the half of the team that doesn't understand the level of complexity, they just might think your idea doesn't make sense at all. So why even support it or be an advocate for it, right? So it's being able to communicate at a simple enough level, sophisticated enough that you're still demonstrating the business value and that you actually have a plan in place that you can operate, but simple enough that anyone in the room can understand what idea you're trying
If
to
I could put
convey.
this a little bit differently, would it boil down to the best connected people? And by connected, I'm referring to people who take the time to understand stakeholders within the organization would stand the best chance of being able to communicate effectively.
Yeah, I think that is a great summary, right? An example I can give you is we were trying to implement a change. We were trying to update a company's analytical framework, their BI system, and not understanding the appetite within the company for it, right? Because change is hard because a lot of people they're comfortable in change and growth aren't exclusive. And so the executive I was working with, he circulated the messaging at his C level, and I worked with the level just below to make sure that everybody understood what we were doing, why we were doing it more importantly, and what the benefit would be for them. After going through that process, a formal presentation to the executive board was no longer required because everybody had bought into the idea, because they intuitively understood what we were trying to do, because we had spent the time cultivating those relationships to communicate
Brilliant.
why we were working.
Idea of companies leveraging data-driven insights to drive revenue growth, but also build out a sustainable competitive advantage that difficult for their competitors to replicate. What would be your thoughts, especially given the environment that we are living in, which is incredibly dynamic, changes happening at an unpredictable pace? What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, and again, for some reason, this seems to be easier said than done, is for
Hmm.
companies to really know who they are and what actually differentiates them in the marketplace. Like with AI, it's funny to me that companies that aren't rooted in, they're not technical companies. Now all of a sudden they have this appetite for building AI applications. And it doesn't make sense to me because that's not actually going to differentiate you in the market, right? Because that's a tool and that tool is going to be widely available to everybody. What actually differentiates you is what, your core competency as a business. And I think sometimes what organizations lose sight of is trying to keep up in the arms race, for example. They lose sight of if I'm keeping up in the arms race, but the arms are widely available to my competition as well,
Hmm.
that's not actually a differentiator, right? Tools alone, I don't think separate companies in spaces like this across industries, right? I think it's actually the value that each company brings to its customers. That's the secret sauce. But I said, I've worked with companies who have lost
Hmm.
sight of that, right? And, okay, we're doing what we're doing. We could do it better if we had better technical tools. Maybe that's true from a customer experience perspective, and that might actually help drive bottom line because now you're automating processes and gaining operational efficiency. But in my experience, those sort of tools typically don't create differentiation in the industry because those tools are widely available. Even if you have it first, in 2 to 5 years, everyone's going to have the same capacity and capability. So how are you doubling down on what actually
I
differentiates a
think that's a
company?
great point there, and something that companies perhaps don't spend enough time in discovering or formalizing in some way, form, or shape. This has been great. Zain, with this idea of using data driven insights and strategy to drive revenue growth, especially at a C suite level, do you find that there's perhaps a couple of areas that tend to get glossed over or don't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
I think often what gets skipped is scalability, right? Especially I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so for the last 20 years, I've seen many tech startups come and go because they're able to get levels of investment because they have a good idea and perhaps they have a good engineering team so they can build a product, but they don't have a scalable plan to actually grow the business profitably over time. And so I think I see that even in my space, right? Is my friend Vinay down the street, his company is doing something amazing. So I feel my ego tells me we should be doing something amazing as well, but it may not actually be scalable for our organization to create value doing that. So is that actually the best thing to do to grow top line? You might see a short-term pop, but then the technical debt that you've created organizationally to create that short-term pop, you have to unfurl all of that as well, right? Because most businesses, people are the top line expense, for most companies. But that's what I would say I see most commonly is short-term
Okay,
thinking.
brilliant.
So
If you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
my top takeaway would be if you don't have a data strategy for your organization, that should be the very next thing your organization is focused on building. Obviously, that's my space, but I just can't overstate that. We're living in the data age, and the need and consumption of data is only going to increase over time. And AI in particular requires so much data to be highly effective. If you don't have a data strategy,
Okay. And for those who are listening and watching who would like to know more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
yeah, our company, so we're called Zeed, right? Our tagline is Data Talks, Zeed Listens. And so if you go to zeedlistens.com, you can find us there. And also, I'm on LinkedIn. Under my full first name, Zainulabedin Shah. If you put me into Google search or
Okay,
put me into
we'll include all
LinkedIn, I
that in
show
the
up
show
right at the
notes.
top.
This has been terrific. Thank you so much for doing this.